The content of this podcast has not been evaluated by Health Canada or the FDA. It is educational in nature and should not be taken as medical advice. Always consult a qualified medical professional to see if a diet, lifestyle change, or supplement is right for you. Any supplements mentioned are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Please note that the opinions of the guests or hosts are their own and may not reflect those of Advanced Orthomolecular Research Incorporated. Welcome to Supplementing Health, a podcast presented by Advanced Orthomolecular Research. We are all about applying evidence-based and effective dietary, lifestyle, and natural health product strategies for your optimal health. In each episode, we will feature very engaging clinicians and experts from the world of functional and naturopathic medicine to help achieve our mission to empower people to live their best lives naturally.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to an episode of Supplementing Health. I'm your host, Dr. Navneer Nibber, and today we have a very exciting guest, someone who I know very well, my colleague, Dr. Arezou Babri. She is a naturopathic doctor and is well established. She has a podcast called The Sovereign Soul and deals a lot with understanding the connection between mind and body and translating that for the public and her patients. So I'm very happy to have you here. Welcome, Dr. Babri.
Thank you, Dr. Nibber, for having me.
So today we're talking about something that's quite topical, especially given that this is the month of love. Something that's pretty universal, I would say, is the science behind heartbreak. Now, heartbreak in itself is this very universal experience. This is something that you have a unique understanding and take on. What kind of drew you into studying and exploring this topic?
Well, just like you said, that's exactly it. It's such a universal and relatable topic. And because every single person has experienced some form of heartbreak in their lives, I really believe that there can actually be a lot of beauty that can be found in heartbreak in terms of the level of growth that it offers and the deeper level of connection that it allows with others. But what really drew my attention to digging deeper into the human experience of heartbreak were two things, actually. One being the number of patients that I was seeing in a clinical setting for various other concerns who would always open up about the devastation and level of trauma that they experienced after a breakup, divorce, or loss. So I was beginning to see the impact it was having on people both emotionally and physically. And I wanted to be able to offer these patients a transformative approach to their healing. And the second reason was my own personal journey, because after experiencing loss myself, I remember the very first thought that I had was that I wanted to heal and be whole because I didn't want any person in my life, including future friendships or even relationships, to meet a broken version of me. Instead, I wanted them to meet the whole version of me. But funny enough, over the years, as I continue to explore this healing journey on my own, I realized the most important person in my life that I wanted to be whole for was actually myself. So that's what really got me started on this whole story.
And that's amazing. You've touched on, some really powerful concepts, the concept of self-love, the concept of healing from trauma and trauma itself. In your podcast, The Sovereign Soul, you speak so much to this mind-body connection instead of parsing them out into, the body has its symptoms. You've created and helped patients understand that connection. Can you give some insight as to what is the mind-body connection for those who aren't really familiar with the concept?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So essentially what it means is that our thoughts, feelings, and beliefs have a direct impact on our biology. And the more we learn about the human body, the more examples we have of this mind-body connection. So we now understand that our brain and physical body are constantly communicating through this bi-directional pathway, and every region of the brain is actually responsible for different bodily functions. So some examples of this would include the brainstem, which supports our breathing, heart rate, or sense of wakefulness and sleep, and the limbic system, which is more commonly known as the emotional brain, helps to regulate our behavior, body temperature, blood sugar regulation, blood pressure, and hormone levels, and also very importantly, the fight or flight response, which is really our stress response. And something that I really focus a lot on in practice is the gut-brain axis. So this is another really brilliant example of how the microbiota within our digestive tract can significantly impact our mood and mental health. So really, more specifically related to today's topic, we now understand that our thoughts can cause physical symptoms within the body. And an example of this would be replaying past hurts and traumas, which can cause all sorts of physical symptoms. And it would be almost like experiencing the situation all over again in real time. And then the reverse is true as well, where our physical symptoms can also impact our mental and emotional health. And this is where we see a lot of people who are dealing with chronic pain, who then end up developing depression and anxiety as a result of that pain.
Which is, incredibly complex, and it can almost feel overwhelming because you're connecting so many different systems and so many different feedback responses. Do you find that, obviously you spoke to the gut-brain connection being a little bit more of that key mediator, but what specifically is happening in the nervous system when we're experiencing the trauma?
Yeah, great question. So I'm actually really happy that you referred to it as trauma, because most people don't really see it from that perspective. And if you were to look up the word trauma, you'll find that it includes any situation that causes either physical, emotional, or spiritual stress or harm. And this can be any event that your body and mind perceives as a stressor. So whenever a stressor arises that we are not adequately equipped to deal with, we experience trauma, which becomes like a scar on the body. And this is why people get flashbacks of certain situations. They have repetitive dreams about scenarios that they've experienced. They develop anxiety and so on and so forth, because your subconscious mind is constantly trying to resolve a problem that it feels was left unaddressed. And more specifically within the nervous system, heartbreak in particular is actually referred to as stress cardiomyopathy, because the stress of heartbreak can cause loss or damage to cardiac muscles. And our brain registers the emotional pain of heartbreak in the same way as it would physical pain. So what happens at the level of the nervous system is that when we experience any stressful event, such as grief, guilt, anxiety, embarrassment, and even shame, the stress response is kicked off, and we have at the level of the hypothalamus a release of a hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone, which then triggers the posterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, which then signals the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. And cortisol is what most people are more familiar with. So this initiates the fight or flight response. And now we see that numerous studies have shown that individuals who are experiencing grief have persistently elevated cortisol levels, which can cause physical symptoms of within the heart, including racing heart, high blood pressure, inflammation, and even atherosclerosis. So really what that's showing is that chronic repeated stressors, which include unresolved trauma or PTSD, cause dysregulation in this hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and we eventually end up with a dysfunction within various organs as well.
And so I think what you're saying is that every trauma is experienced in that way, or is there a grading to the intensity of that trauma or the type of trauma?
That's such a good question, actually. So here's the interesting part. Our brain doesn't know the difference between a real or perceived threat. So you can literally think yourself into a stress response. So it would definitely go through the exact same mechanism. But what I find most people get trapped into is almost like you strengthen that muscle, and every stressor that comes about, you immediately fall into that stress response without that adequate navigation and being able to maybe pull into your conscious mind and pull yourself out of the situation, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that you said that, because a lot of times patients are coming in almost downplaying an experience as though it's in their head, particularly when we're talking about mental emotional traumas. And I think that what you just hit the nail on the head. It's that our thoughts do become behaviors, become, these are all integrated, and it impacts every other system. Now, we spoke to the nervous system, and you spoke to how it physically impacts your heart, with heart rate. How do hormone, endocrine, immune function, how does that get impacted?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So cortisol in particular shifts cellular processes away from long-term metabolic processes more towards survival and homeostasis. So we have a suppression of catabolic and immune function. So this is why most people get sick when they are under heightened stress. And because physical or emotional stress in the body causes inflammation, our body can only focus on one fire at a time. And inflammation quite literally is a fire that the body is trying to put out. So through this mechanism, other systems tend to pay the price. So a few really relevant examples would be the steroid pathway, which is the pathway responsible for all of our sex hormones. And how this is impacted by stress is that the body's demand for cortisol ends up stealing the precursor hormone for progesterone, and therefore our progesterone production suffers. So this is why we see the link between stress causing irregularity in the female menstrual cycle, including heightened PMS symptoms as well. And then furthermore, to bring in another system, cortisol can also inhibit the production of thyroid stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland. So this leads to partial suppression of the main hormone produced by the thyroid gland as well. So really what I see, and I'm sure you see a lot, most notably with a stress response, is that it's a full body biochemical response through initiating these pathways. And we really end up depleting a lot of very essential nutrients and that are often used as building blocks for other pathways in the body. So what happens is people end up in the state of depletion, and they begin to exhibit signs and symptoms of reduced capacity to cope with stress, insomnia, restlessness, brain fog, fatigue, mood dysregulations, exhaustion, cognitive impairments, headache, appetite changes. So really what patients are coming in for are these symptoms, but maybe not necessarily connecting it to the fact that it's a downward spiral effect of a long unaddressed stressor.
So if this is a whole body system, causing it, multiple systems are impacting it, then I think it stands to reason that to rectify or to heal would also be a whole body approach. Where do you start with patients? How do you start that healing journey?
Oh, I love that. Yes. It really, honestly, after years of practice, I've learned that it really is patient specific, and it depends on their readiness for healing. So if they're willing to explore other avenues, so obviously, usually when patients come in, they're looking for a more naturopathic approach where they want to help weave together a story. So when we put that story together for them, it could look like a treatment plan where we're implementing dietary changes, lifestyle changes, supplementation to, again, more specifically help with the state of depletion. I feel like it's very, very necessary at that stage of the game. And then if they're more so open to it, we can begin to explore the whole mind body connection. So implementing spiritual practices, and because I really feel like that's where a lot of people can take control and charge over their lives, because it all comes down to you. You're not really doing anything external. You're really changing the chemistry of your body within, and it's completely under your control.
Which is a very empowering moment, I think, for a lot of patients, is when they make that switch and start engaging in some of these practices for that deeper healing. You kind of mentioned supplementation, diet, lifestyle, and I imagine that they're going to look very different for every person. But when we're specifically talking about heartbreak and heartache, are there specific approaches you're taking?
Yeah, that's interesting. So it really depends on the presentation of symptoms. So I'll look to see, because what I've noticed over time is that stress impacts everyone differently. So it's almost like people have different organ affinities. So for some people, it might manifest as a headache. For some people, it might manifest as fatigue. So I really look to see which system's being impacted, and then fine tune the treatment plan in terms of supplementation from that perspective. But then also implementing the lifestyle factor. So let's say for instance, in terms of implementing mind-body connection practices, if someone's really artistic, we might incorporate that into it. If someone feels like they need movement, we might incorporate that into it, because it doesn't just look like journaling or meditation for everybody. It's very, very different, and there's such a wide array of therapies that I feel like you could reach for.
Yeah, that's a great point. We had a podcast earlier. We're discussing different types of self-care, and a big theme that kept coming through is that self-care will look different for everyone, and sometimes it does need to be structured and disciplined, and sometimes it needs to be about letting go. So oftentimes it's, where are you on the spectrum of healing? One aspect of that personalization and individualization of healing is, as we've talked about, the nervous system, how the nervous system is functioning and how it responds. But why do you think more people are susceptible to these extreme physiologic changes? I mean, you kind of touched on the fact that some people have different organ propensities, but is there a genetic basis? Is there something at our core that makes people react so differently?
Yeah, I love that so much. This is brilliant, because really I think the answer to that is multifaceted, because it really comes down to our emotional resilience, our lifestyles, and how we perceive stress. And I actually talk about this in one of my episodes on my podcast, in that there are a few studies that have shown the negative emotions of people in Western cultures show higher levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, including IL-6, because what the studies had concluded was that the link between negative emotions and interleukin-6 was more so specific to Western cultures, where negative emotions were perceived as problematic, while in Eastern cultures, negative emotions were more easily accepted. So there wasn't that inflammatory response that was taking place. So really, in my opinion, it comes down to how well we take care of both our body and mind, and additionally, how we perceive the experiences we go through. And I think an important part of all of this is community, because really when we feel the most supported by those around us is when we tend to recover from adversity much more quickly and effectively.
The community here. I think that's a really interesting discussion. I want to pivot to kind of another aspect of healing that's been examined more and more, probably in the last 20 years. And that is the concept of the endocannabinoid system. So this is, often researched in relation to CBD and cannabis use, but the system itself as a whole body system seems to be linked somewhat with emotional regulation and is being studied a lot with PTSD. We also see that research, with psilocybin and PTSD. There's lots of these alternative therapies coming up. Can you speak more specifically to the endocannabinoid system and what you've kind of learned from the research there?
Yes, absolutely. So for those who aren't familiar, essentially the endocannabinoid system is a signaling network that promotes homeostasis in the body. And what that means is that the ECS helps to regulate effective communication between cells, as well as helping our internal processes remain stable as our environment changes. So the main role of the ECS is in resolving inflammation, regulating our immune response, and our emotional state, along with pain regulation as well. So in regards to PTSD, the ECS regulates neural functions related to trauma and trauma-based memories. And repetitive stress exposure actually reduces the endocannabinoid levels in the brain, which can cause a disruption in our ability to stop the stress response. So that impacts our adaptive mechanism to stress. And it's sort of like a self-regulating harm reduction system, if you will. And it can be negatively impacted by poor diet and lack of exercise. So there's a lot of really awesome ways we can help to support this system. And as you were saying, there's so much research emerging within this realm, because it's in the grand scheme of things, it's pretty new. So you can really begin to explore supporting the system through exercise, weight management, stress management, and then limiting toxin exposure as well.
Yeah, I like that you said it's kind of this this self-regulating healing system. It's one of the earlier studies that I was looking at kind of likened it to that first response, setting up a perimeter when there's an accident, is just holding everything at bay so that you can initiate and start that healing process. You've spoken to the fact that lifestyle factors really impact this system. Were there any specific recommendations on what people can start doing right away to have a robust endocannabinoid response?
I would say, if out of the things that I mentioned, I mean, I really am personally drawn to exercise myself because of the massive impacts that it has on my overall mental health. But I feel like if you begin to establish stress, healthy coping mechanisms, that's a really fantastic way to kind of strengthen that muscle. So your natural predisposition is to fall into that state of comfort, and that helps to support other systems in the body that are really trying their best. I really like the analogy that you use. They're trying their best to work for us, not against us. So in helping support the body in the ways that we can, I think would be optimal. So I would really focus on stress management through maybe establishing practices that are a part of your day-to-day life, so that when a stressor does arise, you're not meeting it for the first time, that you've established and laid the foundation effectively enough that it's almost like second nature. You know exactly what to do with it.
Oh, I love that. It's training. We often talk about physical training, but that mental training for exposure, because I think what gets forgotten is a lot of our responses to stressors or trauma is protective. And someone once talked about, thanking your body for having that response and then moving past it, especially when it's maybe not the response you need at that time. Maybe it's actually making things worse. But it is often there to help.
Yes. Yeah. I think you nailed it, because I feel like the more I learned in terms of the biochemistry of the body, the more appreciative I was of the body. Sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so many cells that are working so hard to keep me alive. Like sometimes I put my hands on my heart and I'm like, thank you for beating. It's just, it blows my mind, because it's just such a beautiful mechanism that's quite literally trying to keep you alive. And all you have to do is just give it the love and support that it needs. And that looks very different for everyone.
Oh, I think that's a beautiful note to end off on. Thank you so much. I think this was very illuminating and hopefully a helpful insight for anyone who may be dealing with heartbreak, who may have dealt with heartbreak in the past, and is looking for tools to move past it. Where can our listeners find you?
Through social media. Through my social media would probably be the easiest. My website, so there's at www.ourmightywellness.com. If you guys want to reach out, I'm pretty decent at responding to whoever reaches out. But yeah, social media or my website would be probably the best way.
And of course, please listen to the Sovereign Soul, a podcast which you can get on any of the podcast platforms. Thank you again so much, Dr. Babri. This has been an absolute joy.
Thank you, Dr. Nibber, for having me.
Thank you for listening to Supplementing Health. For more information about our guests, past shows, and future topics, please visit aor.ca/podcast or aor.us/podcast. Do you have a topic you want us to cover? We invite you to engage with us on social media to request a future topic, or email us at marketing@aor.ca.